Welcome to the Youth Sport Podcast. My name is Rianna Poskin, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly within youth sport. It feels great when a kid comes up to you and says, "Coach, because of you, my life changed in the best way." It would feel awful to hear that because of you, the coach, a kid doesn't want to have anything to do with it ever again. I believe that kids deserve to have fun, to learn, to grow, to compete, and to play in a great environment. Join me as I interview guests that spill the tea on youth sport in order to help you make an enormous impact with kids right now. This episode of the Youth Sport Podcast is brought to you by Lululemon. I am part of the Lululemon Collective and will receive commissions when you shop through my link. Buying something for you or your loved ones, like my favorite warm down joggers, helps me to continue to bring interesting and empowering conversations for everyone. I have to tell you, when I'm coaching, I want to make sure that I'm dressed appropriately, I'm comfortable, my clothes stand up to all kinds of random situations, and that I have pockets. You never know who's going to ask you to hold something for them or what random things you need to carry with you. The Lululemon warm down joggers take care of all of my needs. I invite you to find your go-to item by browsing through the entire Lululemon site. You won't be disappointed. Please use the link provided in the video description below to start shopping. Welcome back to another episode of the Youth Sport Podcast. I am so excited to introduce my guest today. Dr. Julie Stamm brings a unique perspective on the issues of repeated head impacts in sports. She is a scientist who spent years researching concussions, subconcussive impacts, CTE, and the consequences of repetitive brain trauma in youth. Dr. Stamm is an anatomist with knowledge of childhood development throughout the body and the brain. She has provided medical care for athletes as a certified athletic trainer, was a three-sport athlete throughout high school, and has been competing in sports throughout her life. She's an avid fan of sports. Dr. Stamm studied the long-term consequences of repeated head impacts in sports as a doctoral student at the Boston University CTE Center under the mentorship of Dr. Robert Stern. She also received training in brain imaging at the Psychiatry Neuroimaging Laboratory at Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and conducted part of her research on former NFL players there with mentors Dr. Martha Shentins, and Dr. Inga Corte. Dr. Stamm became interested in the topic of sports-related brain trauma in kids as an athletic trainer when she cared for a high school athlete with post-concussive syndrome. She published the first scientific paper ever to examine the long-term consequences of repeated hits to the head through youth tackle football with her team at the BU CTE Center in 2015. Her work has been published in high-impact, peer-reviewed journals and covered in mainstream media publications worldwide. Additionally, she has published work on CTE, a variety of concussion-related topics, and pressures on clinicians to prematurely return concussed athletes to play. And I think that's really important. She received her doctorate in anatomy and neurobiology from Boston University's School of Medicine, is a proud alumna of the athletic training education program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and was a graduate assistant athletic trainer at Boston University. She is currently a certified and licensed athletic trainer. Dr. Stamm is currently a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches human anatomy and continues to study brain trauma in youth sports. Today, specifically, we're going to talk about Dr. Stamm's book, The Brain on Youth Sports. And I love this title, such a good title. It's the science, the myths, and the future. So this book is for parents, coaches, school administrators, healthcare providers, and other scientists and researchers. So super important for all of us. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I'm really excited to chat with you. This is an important conversation. I don't think enough of us are having it. I also think that this is a really challenging conversation because I believe that a lot of us are in denial and we would actually don't want to know this information because then we might actually have to start questioning what we're doing with our kids.
Yeah, I think that's so true. We didn't know a lot of this even before the last decade. And we're learning so much, but with that, we have to kind of re-examine sports and how we're playing these sports, what we're letting our kids play with these sports. But at the same time, we need to remember that sports are so important. So, we really need to find that balance of safety while still allowing for all of those great benefits of sports.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you a quick story because I had a lot of things that were coming up. I was remembering a lot of things as I was reading your book. And the biggest thing that I thought about, and right at the beginning of your book, you talk about empathy. And I played soccer Division II, and I did not have a lot of empathy for my opponents. And one particular story is that I actually went up for a head-on-head collision with my opponent, and she left life flighted out with a frontal bone injury, and I continued to play the game. And now I went up to her, and you have your sportsmanship. You go up and you say, like, are you okay? And I'm really sorry, and that kind of stuff. But once she left the field, my life stayed the same and hers didn't. And it wasn't until the next year when we were actually at her school. We played an away game at her school, and my coach called me over and he said, "Hey, Rianna, I just want you to check up on this girl and just say hi." And it wasn't until I saw her and talked to her about what she had to go through in that year when her life completely was derailed and mine wasn't, that I sat back and was like, whoa, I hurt somebody. And it wasn't intentional, but at the same time, it was one of those things where I was kind of praised as being tough. And still that story will come up and people will say, hey, Rianna used to play when she was in university, and that's a long time ago now, but it'd be like, oh, she was so tough. You should hear this one story. And now I look back and I'm like, I don't like that story as being that I was tough. I don't like that story that it makes me, like have this glorified situation that happened when she, probably couldn't play sport again. And so can you talk about empathy a little bit and what kids should learn at a young age? Because we're all human beings, and just because we're on different sides of whatever it is, the court or the field or whatever it is, how can kids use the human nature to really experience sport in a better way?
Yeah, I think that is a really powerful story that you told. And I think in reality, she was probably going for that header really hard too. And it was in some ways luck that it was her and not you, and yet we look at that as a toughness thing, like you said. And, that empathy is really important. There's another person on the other side. There's a person underneath that helmet. And especially in helmeted sports in our society, it's very easy to just see them as a warrior and not as a person. And I think sometimes we do that intentionally, kind of with what you mentioned early on too, that if we don't see them as a person, it's easier to accept that, they're inflicting pain and damage and lifelong damage. We don't see people after they retire either. And I think that's a hard thing for kids. They just see these athletes on, TV on Saturday or Sunday, and then, they don't see what happens after they retire, or they don't see the hours they're spending in the athletic training room to prepare and recover. And I think that's important. I think with social media, that's changing a little bit now. We're seeing more of the athlete, but there was a study that was done that showed with fMRI imaging that parts of the brain that typically light up with empathy didn't light up in football fans when they watch football plays, but non-football fans, it did light up. So, if they're watching, you have two people, one who's a fan, one who's not, watching the same, brutal hit in football, the person who's a fan isn't going to see that as brutal or violent in the same way that somebody who, isn't a fan would. So I think that's a cultural change we need to try to shift. And that reminder that we want to be tough and have grit and play hard, but we also need to see our opponents as people. And I think, maybe that gets lost a lot in our current appreciation of sports.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your bio, you talk about how this became an interesting topic for you because of working with one particular kid. Can you talk about that story and kind of how that impacted you?
Yeah, I knew that I wanted to go on and study more, get my PhD, and I didn't really know what exactly I wanted to study yet. I knew it was sport related, but there was an athlete that had a concussion, and we had several concussions that year. But this one athlete, wasn't the star player by any means. He just liked to be out there and play, and he didn't get better. It didn't seem like a bad concussion to start with, which is a thing with concussions, right? You could have somebody who loses consciousness and is fine within a couple of days. And then you have somebody who just didn't feel right and they don't feel right for months. And this kid was the latter. And I left that clinical rotation about 3 or 4 months later, and he still couldn't raise his heart rate without symptoms coming back. And watching what that did to his life, kind of as you talked about, the friendships, school, more than just sports, it had a huge impact on him. And that really got me interested in studying that. And especially with younger people, how does that affect their life? What are the long-term consequences of these impacts too?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to make sure that everybody knows, you said it already, that you are not against youth sport by any means. And you go into so many positive things that youth sport bring to young children. And there's one quote that you even had about how the team sports was even more beneficial in some respects than some of the arts. So did you want to talk about all the positive benefits of how kids are, what happens with them when they get to play sport, what all the good things are? And then we'll talk about how we can still keep our kids in it, but then maybe what we should be thinking about in order to make some changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that you brought that up too, because, I think sometimes people see the scientists studying this work and think, oh, they're just in a lab and, they don't really get it. And we totally get it. We love sports.
Yeah.
And that's why we do this work. And sports have incredible benefits. The health benefits and physical activity benefits are huge. Developing physical activity patterns that last a lifetime. When you're active as a kid, you're much more likely to be active as an adult. It is important that coaches really intentionally incorporate activities that will raise the heart rate, because just being at a practice doesn't mean that you're actually getting all the physical activity you should. Yeah. But it's a great first step, and it's definitely beneficial on the physical activity side. The mental health benefits are huge, the emotional health, the social aspect. As you mentioned with team sports, there's evidence that team sports can have even greater effects because of that team environment, that you can rely on your team members and the bonds that you form with your team members. That doesn't mean that individual sports don't have benefits, and they can have team aspects to individual sports too. But some evidence suggests that individual pressure versus being part of a team can be more beneficial to be on a team. And it's also not to say that, music and arts can't be an outlet that's great for kids. But some research has shown that sport can have even greater effects and benefits for kids.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I love these quotes that you had written in your book. So with your pro sport statements, concerns about brain health are valid, but they shouldn't be a reason to quit sports altogether. And then there's another one that I really liked, but then completely banning certain sports for kids should not be part of the conversation. Changing contact sports to eliminate the greatest sources of repetitive brain trauma, at least at young ages, is a far better option. So maybe in order to help people understand a little bit, I thought it doesn't have to be a real case study, but if we just kind of put in the context of an 8-year-old boy that might be wanting to start to play football, can you just kind of go through some of the things that kid might be going through? And let's even talk about the tackling. So I know in the United States, at what age are they allowed to start tackling in football?
There are some programs that start tackle as young as age 5.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
not all programs, but there are some that go that young.
Okay, so let's just break that down. So let's even say we could even go younger to that 5-year-old. What's going on developmentally with that 5-year-old kid, and what's going to be happening if they continue to play tackle football in those different development stages?
Yeah, there's so much going on in the brain of a child, even through adolescence, but especially as a child. And there are different peaks that happen at different times with different structures, which makes it a little bit complicated. Those peak times where development is happening really, really quickly are also peak times where that development can be disrupted. If there's more going on, there's more to disrupt. So we worry about that with these repetitive head impacts and with concussions, but we hadn't really looked at that as being a potential source of long-term problems until more recently. So some things that are going on in the brain is we have our axons, which are those pathways, they're carrying information in our brain, and we insulate them kind of like, the rubber coating on a wire. And that insulation process, creating myelin is what it's called. and laying down that myelin is happening throughout childhood. And that's a really peak time, especially that 8 to 12 range is a critical time for that as well. So that's one process. Other processes, we have increased blood flow to the brain. We're creating more and more connections within the brain, and there's potential to disrupt that. So an 8-year-old or a 5-year-old, well, I can say for sure the 7 to 8-year-old child, studies show that they receive around 160 impacts in a season.
Wow.
More or less, for certain athletes. And keep in mind that when I talk about these youth seasons, that's about half the number of games and practices that a high school season would be.
Okay.
So, there are fewer impacts, but the impacts per event are not that far off from the high school or college players. When they get up to that 9 to 12 range, they're averaging 270, 300 impacts or even more. Some studies show kids that had over 800 impacts in just a short Pop Warner or USA football kind of season.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah. And that can be disrupting some of these developmental processes. So we did some research with former NFL players and former high school and college football players as well that showed long-term consequences related to that. So we looked at depression, apathy, executive function. So those are things like planning, decision-making, and controlling our behavior, things like that.
Yep.
And those who started at a younger age were worse off later in life. And we also looked at that using some objective tests and memory and learning as well. And those who started earlier were worse off later in life. So even structure in the brain, we've seen differences in structure based on that. And it doesn't really seem to appear until later. And I talk more about that, break down more of that in the book, but it seems to be something that might show up a little bit later in life, not necessarily right away.
Okay.
But there are definitely some consequences that can come from these repetitive impacts in kids. And even though, I often hear, well, I played and I'm fine. Well,
yeah.
But how can you know how you would have functioned had you not had those impacts? Maybe some of those little, things with learning and memory that might be a little bit of a struggle, or maybe depression could be related to that. Although there are many, many, many causes of depression, but it's just hard to say for sure what a person would have functioned like without having hit their head repeatedly as a kid.
Yeah. And I loved what you said, where it was like, well, could you ever imagine that it's normal that a kid's going to bump their head into a wall 250 times in a 12-week period, but then you have no problem whatsoever if your kid's doing that in sport? And I think we always do that. We always make these exceptions to the rule because it's sport. But then, like if your kid was running face first into a wall over and over and over again in your house, you would stop it. So I think that's really something that you can think about. It's like, where do we draw the line? Why is there the exceptions for sport and there isn't in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like fighting, in some sports, right? It's a normal part of some sports, but if somebody was fighting like that on the street, it would be a problem. So why is it not a problem, on the ice or the field or whatever? And it's the same thing, if you had a kid hit their head against the wall, you would say, well, we need to protect your brain. You shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But hitting it against another person who's actually coming at you, not just a stationary wall, that's okay.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's just a cultural thing, right? It's part of that toughness that you talked about. And because it's something that we enjoy watching, we just try to kind of ignore the fact that, it's probably not a good thing. And not that it's good for anyone to hit their head at any age, but, we're not going to prevent every head impact. That's not the goal here. Yeah. But, especially in kids whose brains are rapidly developing, if we can eliminate that, give them more time to develop fully, we can, and also fewer career impacts, we can really go a long way to protect them.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to branch off with what you're saying, because two things popped up. So let's talk about, first of all, how we can change the sport so that they don't have to actually stop playing the sport. But you have some really great ideas in your book about how kids can still get the benefits and the fun and the competitiveness out of these sports, but with some slight changes. So can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So let's start with some sports that have made some big changes to eliminate those impacts. So soccer has eliminated heading before age 11 and limited that to age 13. And that's in the US, but worldwide, there's so much more conversation right now about this. And some countries are even talking about, banning it before 13 and then slowly, gradually bringing it in until 18. So a lot of strides are being made there, and it's still soccer. It's just not heading at that age. Hockey in the USA moved the introduction of checking up to age 13 in 2011. And the same was done in Canada in 2013. And some leagues even don't have it until age 15. And it's still hockey. You just don't check, right? Mm-hmm. And there have been changes made in football, but they haven't really eliminated those impacts. So, if you can eliminate tackling, you're eliminating the primary source of impacts.
Okay.
Flag football is a common option. Also, there's some new types of football like tackle bar. So tackle bar football, there are bars that are on the back, and they still wear helmets and shoulder pads and all that. But the bars on the back, you kind of wrap up the athlete or the opponent like you would with a tackle, but then instead of taking them to the ground, you rip the bars off.
Oh, so interesting.
It's kind of building some of those skills without the actual end of the play being a tackle.
Right.
There's another form called flex football. That's like a NFL type practice. It's a very fast-paced version of the game. There are different ways to learn about the game without hitting your head. And I really want to emphasize that, there have been legislative attempts to ban tackling before certain ages. It varies a bit by state. And people always say, well, it's banning football. No, it's not banning football. We don't want to ban football. But if we remove tackling, one piece of football, it's really just changing how the play ends. Okay. So we're still moving the ball 10 yards, we're still passing, we can still block, starting in an upright stance, being safer. Some leagues still have padding, so it's still football. It's just changing how it ends at the young age. So you can teach so much about the game without those repetitive head impacts, and then you can bring those in as they get older.
Yeah, you talk about a lot of the things of how great sport is, and that we can still have better skilled and athletic games, and you can still get all of these beautiful components of sport without the violent aspect of it. And I love that you pointed that out, because I really love watching a good hockey game, and if it's fast and if it's athletic, I love it. I love it. Love it. Same thing with other sports. So the main things that you're talking about, I think, that come up repeatedly throughout your book are rugby, football, hockey, and soccer, specifically with heading the ball. Those would be your main 4 sports, right? That have the impacts with the head that are concerning.
Yep. Those are the main 4, in particular men's lacrosse as well, because checking is allowed in men's lacrosse. That would be another one, but I would put that as number 5 on the list. Yeah.
But all of those games are really fun to watch, and there's elements of it that could be done without having to demolish your opponent, right?
Oh, absolutely. For sure. I think about, was it Odell Beckham Jr. one-handed catch in the end zone, like if we can value the athletic plays like that, more than just these crushing hits.
Yeah.
That's what should get us excited about football, and, the amazing, shots in hockey and soccer. There's so much to value in these sports that aren't the violent aspects of them. Yeah. And you can still be tough. I was a center in basketball, and I loved, overpowering someone in the post. That was fun to me, that physical aspect, but I didn't have to hit my head to do it.
Right.
So it can still be a component without the repetitive impacts.
Yeah, I think the culture, what you talked about already, is something that is the biggest issue. And I can use an example. I don't know if you watched the Stanley Cup playoffs this past year, but Brendan Gallagher got slammed down headfirst into the ice, and he came up all bloody. And the response, like I was looking at a lot of the posts on social media, and so many people loved it. They thought he was this warrior. It was just incredible that he could come back and play. But it's not their head that's getting smashed into the ice. Like, it's totally fine if you're watching someone else and you think that that's entertaining to you. But, given the situation, if it was reversed, would you be like, yeah, come on over here, let me slam your head into the ice, and then you can kind of feel? They would say, no, there's no way. And like what you also said too, where there's the exception to the rule with sport, it could actually be a criminal offense if that's done in real life, So here's the thing with the culture, it just kind of gets thrown out the window when it comes to sport as opposed to real life. And so that part of it with football culture particularly, you've probably got a lot of people on your side that are saying, yes, this makes sense to me, but you also probably have a whole lot of people that are rooted in that sport culture that don't want the changes. What is your biggest example, or what's the most striking thing that that person that may be on the fence might need to hear in order to really think about this?
Yeah. So, I think hearing about the long-term consequences is a big thing.
Yeah.
And that, there are consequences for disrupting development. There are consequences for repeated hits to the head, whether that's CTE or not. Most concussions will recover very quickly, but there can be long-term consequences of that. And it can really, really throw your life into a really difficult place. But I think also just as important for them to understand is the consequences is that Tom Brady never played football before high school, tackled football before high school. Michael Strahan didn't play till he was a senior in high school. Jerome Bettis was an all-city bowler before high school. And the list could go on and on. I have many more in the book as well, that these people who are all-stars never tackled before high school. So this idea that you have to tackle young in order to have a chance at a scholarship or be an all-star is just false. You are more likely to have long-term success if you build your athleticism young, because those critical periods for development that I talked about, earlier, that 8 to 12 range and even before, all that's going on in the brain, that also makes you better able to learn athletic skills, not necessarily sports-specific skills or tackling or things like that, but just develop your overall athleticism, motor coordination, spatial awareness. All of that can be developed when you're younger. And if you think about some of our greatest athletes, you could give them any sport and they could pick it up really quickly and get really good at it. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of athlete that you want to develop as a kid, right? Is somebody who is such an athlete that you can give them, you can teach them to tackle later and they'll get great at it. Or you could teach them to check later and they'll be great at it. So even in hockey, because of that ban on checking before age 13 and the fact that it went into effect in 2011, the guys that are entering the NHL now, like Cole Caulfield, who had a great Stanley Cup Finals, he wouldn't have checked when he was younger. Yet they're playing great hockey. So I think that's a big thing, is that you're not losing anything by not tackling young. You can learn all of those skills later.
So one of the things that stood out with me was with you talking about sport specialization. A lot of the conversation is around repetitive injuries. And I didn't really think about it in terms of the brain. I was mostly just thinking about it with the body. And then I was thinking, okay, so if a kid is playing, let's take hockey, for instance, because year-round hockey is really trendy. Everybody wants their kid on the ice all the time. And when you talk about practices, even in your book, you talk about how coaches need to be aware of how they're changing the formation of what they're actually doing in practices. So now if you take a kid who's playing on maybe 3 different teams, because it's not necessarily the same team year round, you don't know what another coach is doing in their practices throughout the year. So one of the main things that you talk about is decreasing the risk of head injury and the impacts that the kid is having. And by changing the structure of the practice itself, you can actually take note of how many times they might actually have impacts throughout their season. But then I was thinking that might be impossible to do because they're playing year round. So can you talk about that a little bit more? Like, how important is it to actually give kids a break maybe from their specific sport? Is that even something that you recommend?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I think we definitely should. Yeah, they definitely need a break. I believe the sports specialization guidelines suggest no more than 8 months of the year and taking, not necessarily 8 months straight. So like taking breaks in between. And it's really important for, as you said, with the body to learn different motor patterns. If you're just doing the same sport, you're doing a lot of the same motor patterns. Yeah. So you want to develop as that athlete and different motor patterns, but with the brain too, I think about this with soccer a lot, because I believe the guidelines for soccer in that 12 and 13 age range is coaches need to make sure that the soccer players don't have the ball more than 25 times in a week. I'm like, well, first off, who's counting?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Who's there with a clicker on the sideline counting each kid?
Yeah.
And how are you counting them if they're in 3 different leagues?
Exactly.
Right? That's not possible. So, with hockey, similar, if they're playing, there's not a specific contact limit, but if they're, playing in multiple leagues, that's really hard. Football tends to have less organized contact football in the off season, and not in the same way as those other sports, but I do think that's growing a bit.
Okay.
So, it's another sport to be concerned about. So what we're seeing when we talk about the research and the impacts over a season, we're talking one, high school season or college season, and it's not even capturing all of those other impacts. I think that's an important thing to point out, that they're likely receiving many more that we're not capturing. I think coaches really need to be aware of the fact that their kids are probably playing in other leagues, and do everything they can to limit those impacts within their own team. So minimizing contact time, and, really also taking that cultural piece into effect. If you have a state, for example, that has limited contact time, but then you're just fitting all that contact into a shorter amount of time, you could actually be leading to more impacts. So really consciously decreasing those impacts. And I want to also say that doesn't hurt play. There are many examples in football, for example, where teams eliminated or greatly limited contact. Maybe they only tackled a few times in the preseason, and they won state championships.
Okay.
Or colleges that have been really successful. So you don't have to tackle all the time in practice in order to know what to do on the field. Like it's tackling, right? Like you can do that, and you can learn that with tackling dummies, for example, or wrapping up but not taking to the ground, and still be really successful on the field. And I think that's a really important point to make too.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times we're talking about there's just so much going on, and especially if you've got youth sport coaches, and that's primarily who is going to be listening to this podcast. They're volunteers,
Mm-hmm.
They've got other things going on. They may be rushing from work and going straight to practice, and they're having to manage all of these children at the same time. And there's so much to think about. There's, so many different elements that you have to fit in. So I really appreciate that you're just saying, like, maybe this is something that you can just consider as being an important piece of that practice. What's going on? How are those kids being impacted on a regular basis when they're in your care? And how can we make small adjustments in order to just make that scenario a little bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. And, practice is not, the game scenario, and there is a higher concussion risk in games because of just the intensity of games, but we spend way more time in practice. So overall, more concussions happen in practice because we spend more time there. So that's a really easy place, and, more impacts in practice too, which makes it a really easy place to intervene and really limit those impacts and get those numbers down. So, I think that's something that coaches can really take from this, that, the more that you do in practice to limit those impacts, not only will we be protecting the brain, but we're going to keep the kids healthy for game day.
Yeah.
Just their whole body, and fresh, and, and ready for game day. So that's a big thing. And you're right that so many of these coaches are volunteering. And I think even with some of the changes that have happened with USA football, just looking at tackling technique and things like that, I don't think that they go far enough, because it's still tackling and the brain still moves in the skull. But all of this is done with the best of intentions. And we just need to keep taking those steps to protect our kids. And, I think that the coaches out there really want to protect their athletes, and they want the best for their athletes. It's just, it might take a little bit of a shift to, really understand what that means, and what we can do to best protect our athletes.
One of the things that you talk about is that the child's head is basically like a bobblehead, and because of their development, that their head is bigger than their body. And then you talk about throwing a helmet on top of that, and then that, changes the weight that's on top of their head as well. So you mentioned that the brain is still moving within the skull. And can you just tell us a little bit about the safety equipment and what the research is showing on the equipment?
Yeah. So I think that's a big myth with football, is that, well, the helmets there'll be a concussion proof helmet,
Right.
And there is not a concussion proof helmet, and there won't be, because the brain still moves in the skull. And you don't actually have to hit your head to get a concussion or to sustain, an effect from a subconcussive hit to the head or repetitive hits. If your brain is moving within the skull because you had a hit to the body that caused your head to go back and forth, that can still cause a concussion, or that can still damage the brain. So a helmet's not going to do any good in that situation if you're not even hitting your head. And, helmets do a great job of doing what they were designed to do, which is prevent skull fractures. They're great at that. But, even until recent years, youth helmets were essentially adult helmets, just shrunk and sometimes not even shrunk that much for kids. And a child's head grows faster in proportion to their body. So their head is larger in proportion to their body. And, their body doesn't catch up until they get a little bit older. And that creates that bobblehead effect. So when you put a helmet on them, their neck muscles aren't strong enough to really stabilize their head. And, it's a big myth that, well, kids don't hit that hard. Well, they might not hit quite as hard with as much speed, but because of that bobblehead effect, their accelerations and forces that they're feeling in their head and their brain are just as large as, the high school and college kids. They can't stabilize their head. So their brain is moving within the skull, and they're feeling similar forces with these hits. So even though it's not necessarily quite as hard, or like we see on TV, with our college and NFL players, the force is really the same. It's kind of a myth that our equipment is just going to solve the problem, because it's not. And one thing I want to also mention is a higher price doesn't mean more safety. That's a big thing for parents and for coaches to know, that just because a helmet costs more and, seems like it might be more protective, it's really not. Virginia Tech has some great ratings for helmets for football, hockey, basically any sport you can think of that has a helmet. They have ratings for them. And their ratings will give you an idea of the safety of a certain helmet. But if they all, so many football helmets are 5 stars, and if any difference between them is basically nothing, it's not going to protect you really much more than any other helmet. So one of those 5-star helmets might be, $1,500, and one might be $500. Like, they're going to have the same protection. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as a parent as well, because parents want to protect their kids as much as possible, and might think that the expensive helmet is going to do it, but don't fall into that.
Okay. And can you talk about mouth guards too, please?
Yeah. So there's some idea that mouth guards might help prevent against concussions.
Yeah.
But really, that data is just inconclusive.
Okay.
There's really no evidence that it helps that much. It might be a little bit helpful for a blow to the chin.
Okay.
Where you're biting down on that mouth guard, might dissipate a little bit of force, but it's still not really going to prevent concussions. It's not going to prevent every concussion, and it's definitely not something we should be relying on. It, again, does a great job of doing what it is intended to do, which is protect the teeth.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So good to know. So basically what you're saying is the equipment is not going to solve all of our problems.
Yes. Yeah. It's important to have this equipment, but it's not going to solve the concussion problems.
Yeah. So really what you're emphasizing is just having a look at what's actually going on at the different development stages and protecting our children, yet still allowing them to play.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest key is we should have these sports. We should let kids play sports. It's my biggest fear with my research that's going to make people pull their kid from sports. And that's not what we want. We can protect the brain and have them play sports. It is possible to do both.
Yeah. So one of the things in order to protect our kids is you talk about the officiating of games. Mm-hmm. And I am a youth sport parent, and I am watching all of my kids' games. And one of the hardest things that I have is that when plays are let go early and then the game progressively gets worse. And then because often what happens is if a kid thinks that they're going to get away with something, they're just going to keep getting away with it. And so can you just talk about how officiating is so important and how we actually have to stick to the rules that are being set in place?
Absolutely. So I had a mother of a 6th grade football player tell me that, well, she wanted him to play flag football, but then they just started getting really rough in flag football and basically tackling each other there. So she figured he might as well have a helmet and pads on,
Yeah.
And it was a really valid point. If flag becomes tackle without padding, then what's the point of it being flag?
Yeah.
So it's really important to enforce rules. The rules are there for a reason, to protect the kids. And so, as kids get older and bigger and stronger and faster, we really need to make sure that we're enforcing the rules that are there to protect them and keep it flag or tackle bar and not tackle. And, really making sure that those kids aren't getting away with checking at younger ages in hockey or heading in soccer. Those rules are there for a reason. And again, we're not wrapping kids in bubble wrap. We're not going to prevent every fall and every concussion, but we can prevent those repetitive impacts that are inherent to these games if we, enforce those rules.
Yeah. So I've seen a couple of scenarios where kids are not prepared for the hit that's coming because the rules aren't there. Like if you're not allowed to check, the kid might not be prepared to be checked. And so have you thought about that at all, where maybe coaches as well need to have a conversation with their kids in order to set themselves up, in order to read plays in a certain way so that they set themselves up for success without, being blindsided?
Yeah. And I think that's also a big part of that kind of building athleticism when they're young.
Yeah.
Is if we can build that spatial awareness in a low risk situation, then they'll be more prepared for it in a high risk situation as they get older. And, there are different drills you can do with that and ways that you can, prepare them for that without having the actual risk of being hit. And, that's a really important thing, that unanticipated hit. There's a lot of talk about neck strengthening being a potential preventative measure for concussions, which it can help. But it can't help if you aren't tensed up and ready for the hit. Right.
Yeah.
And that's some of the evidence that's been shown, is that neck strengthening, again, will never prevent every concussion. It can be helpful. It's not going to hurt for sure, but it really does nothing if it's an unanticipated hit. Right. So those hits can be more dangerous for the brain. And so we really need to train our athletes to be prepared for those and enforce those rules to try to get those unanticipated hits out of the game as well, at the youth level, at every level of, to keep athletes safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the typical mom in your book scenario. I am the mom that would probably want people convincing me to say that, no, it's fine, it's okay. So I have kids that are 6, 9, and 11, and they are all involved in hockey, and we love it. It's great. It's great for so many reasons. So for people that are in the sport world that are trying to convince moms that it's okay, what would you say to those moms that are trying to make decisions about having their kids playing contact sports?
I'd say, stick with your gut. If you have concerns, they're valid concerns. Now, keep your kid in sports. Definitely do that. But, I think it can be really tough on parents who, have, maybe their kids' friends are playing, or the other parents have kids that are playing. And, I've seen that in my community and with friends of mine that have kids in that age. I even saw a mother peer pressure the 11-year-old, like in front of the mom. Well, you're going to play next year. You're fine. Right. And, I thought that was a lot of guts to walk up and peer pressure a child in front of their parent when they knew that the parent didn't want them, to play for health reasons. Like who was that mom to make a health decision for someone else's kid?
Right.
Right. So, stick with your gut. And I think finding alternative opportunities is really important. So, if your child isn't playing a certain sport or a certain version of a sport because of those concerns, making sure that they can play a different version, or that they're doing other, training, or, things that they're staying involved in sport. I think that's really important too, because they need, an outlet and a team or a way to stay involved. And I think it's important to have that conversation with your child too, and just be really clear as to why you're making these decisions, and because you care about them. And I think, like many decisions that parents make, they may not understand right away, but in the long run, they'll probably see the value in that.
Yeah. Some of the things that you talked about in terms of the development windows, maybe that can help with the decision making. And I thought it was really cool that, so you actually call them critical windows or critical periods and maturation windows. And in strength and conditioning, we often look at these development windows for speed and strength. And so I thought it was really cool that we could maybe just address this a little bit more, where yes, like there are these critical windows where your kid has a benefit of becoming more athletic, but then we also have this other piece that we have to consider as well. So when it comes to making these decisions, what are those maturation windows that we should be considering?
Yeah, those maturation windows can actually be windows of vulnerability. Too.
Okay.
So that's a way to think about it, that they're windows of opportunity, but also windows of vulnerability. And so it does differ a bit based on the structure that we're talking about. And there's not like a one window fits all.
Yeah.
But 8 to 12 is a big one. There just happens to be a lot happening in that range, and really in particular that range leading up to puberty. So it might be a little bit longer in somebody who's a little bit later maturing. Boys tend to be a little bit later than girls. So that window of about 3 to 4 years leading up to puberty is a time where there's just so much development going on in the brain. So that's a really important time to protect the brain, and get the most out of that development.
Yeah, you have this quote that says, "At what age is it appropriate for a child to start tackling and sustaining repetitive brain trauma?" And I almost feel like you're being sarcastic there.
Yeah, well, it's never really safe to repeatedly hit your head.
Yeah.
But I think maybe we can phrase it that when is it less bad for you to hit your head?
Right.
And with the caveat that even when they get into high school, that is a time where there's still a lot going on, and can we minimize those impacts as much as possible, by limiting them in practice. If we can eliminate them when they're younger and minimize them when they're older, then we can go a long way to protect them and not have these long-term consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we can't prevent everything. And we know that going in, you sign your waiver at the beginning of the season, taking all the risk, and absorbing that. But I think there's some things that we can think about a little bit so that we just alter, what that risk actually is.
Yeah. There's always, like you said, always going to be risk, but to me, it's those parts of the game that inherently carry risk.
Yeah.
That if you are tackled to the ground, there's going to be forces transmitted to your brain. That's just how it works.
Yeah.
So if we can eliminate that part when the brain is rapidly developing and really limit that after, then we're doing a lot to protect our brain.
Yeah.
There's evidence to show, that around 2,800, 3,000 hits over a career could be, at least for some people, a threshold where the risk of long-term consequences increases. Well, if you're averaging even 300 hits, in youth football, and then you jump up to 600 hits or even 1,000 hits a season in high school football, well, you're going to get to that number pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But if we go a long way to eliminate those hits as a kid and really limit them when they're in high school, well, most people aren't going to reach even close to that threshold if we do it right.
Awesome.
So
that's awesome.
It can be done, and the game can be played similarly, but the way that we practice and play the game when we're younger, if that's changed, I think it's also about saving the game, right? I think there's so many people dropping out right now that
that's true too.
Yeah, it's really about it's a way to preserve the game.
Let's finish off with some major impact. Do you have anybody that you've worked with that would really ring a bell for someone listening, where something could have been prevented early on and their life could have changed? Does anything come up?
Yeah. So one story that, and it's not with a youth athlete, but it's with a professional athlete. And you can find this story in the news from a few years back, but Ted Johnson was a player for the New England Patriots.
Okay.
And he had a concussion, and he went back to practice. He had a green jersey on, which meant that, don't hit him. That's a sign for the teammates not to hit him. And his coach said, yeah, take that off. Is that kind of testing him and, that toughness thing, right? You wanted to test the athlete. How tough are you? You can take that green jersey off. And, unfortunately, his athletic trainer was there and said, didn't really say anything, actually. And so he took the jersey off, went back in, and pretty much right away got hit again. And it really sent him into a spiral. Like he was not himself for months and months. And, he had a very bad concussion after that, even had a lot of life downward spirals after that, related to just his concussion. And, it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Had he just not taken that contact. And I think that's a good lesson for youth athletes, is that, your concussion, if you have a concussion, your risk of having a second concussion is higher if you don't let yourself fully recover.
Mm-hmm.
And your risk of having worse outcomes and, having more long-term problems from that are higher if you don't let it recover. And even if you have a concussion in a game and you say, well, I'm just going to finish this game,
right,
your risk of having symptoms for a longer period of time, and worse symptoms are higher. All the evidence shows that if you sustain a concussion and you come out of the game right away, that most of these concussions resolve within a few weeks. Mm-hmm. And your odds of having any, more severe symptoms or long-term symptoms are much, much, much lower. So take care of yourself.
Yeah.
You're important. And as important as that one game might seem, or that one practice where you're trying to prove yourself, your long-term health is more important. And that affects your school and your friends and all of that. And you'll be in a better place and a better athlete in the long run if you let yourself heal.
Yeah. And now the decision-making piece is huge, because what you're talking about is having an athletic trainer there who's able to assess the athletes. In Canada, we don't have a lot of athletic trainers that are on the field in practices or games. And so the decision-making, you actually mentioned in your book that the child is not at a cognitive ability to make the proper decisions. So we are relying on adults to see the best interest in these situations. So can you talk about how important that is and how difficult it can be?
Yeah, I often hear like, well, but my kid wants to play tackle football, or they want to, check in hockey or whatever it may be. And, kids are focused on the now, right? This is even up through, college age. Like, why do college kids make some not so intelligent decisions sometimes, right? Because their brain is still at that age wired to think about the now and not think about the future. And the part of our brain that understands emotion is developed before the part of our brain that is able to control those emotions and inhibit those feelings. So a kid is going to just see the immediate situation and say, I want to play with my friends. They're not going to think about the long-term consequences and protecting themselves in the long term. So that's where an adult who does have that developed brain needs to come in and step in to protect them. So, just saying, well, the child can decide isn't really the safest option. I think also, when they're on the field, sometimes, especially with kids, they may not understand what it is that they're feeling if they have a concussion. So both in educating youth athletes, talking about it in a way that they would understand, if you just say like, you may have, sensitivity to light or noise, or you may this and that, they may not understand what those symptoms really mean. Okay. But if you say, well, if the bright lights are really bothering you, maybe that's something that they'd understand. So communicating with kids and trying to look for some of those things that you would notice as a parent, but somebody else might not notice because you just know your kid better than anybody else.
Yeah.
It's important to keep an eye on those things too, and then remove them from the game. And it can be really hard. I know that, in championship games or big games, or maybe grandma and grandpa came and watched this game or whatever it may be, it can be really hard to make those decisions. And I totally acknowledge that, but, that one game isn't worth any, major poor outcomes that come from it. It's better to just keep them safe and take them out.
Yeah. So let's finish off with some tips. So if somebody does have some kind of head contact in practice or in games, what can we do immediately to help make those decisions to see if it's going to be a scenario that we need to investigate further?
Yeah. If there's any doubt whatsoever, bring them out and, do an evaluation. It's easier if you have somebody on the sideline who's a trained medical professional. And I also do say trained because this is a very rapidly evolving field. And we ask so much of so many of our healthcare providers that it's hard for me to keep up, and I'm in the field, so it's important to have somebody who's trained and up to date on concussion management, because some of these things can change. So talking to somebody, it's easier if you have somebody who does have that training. But if there's any doubt, even if it was just a big hit or a fall that would be concerning, bring them out and talk to the athlete, and ask them how they're feeling. Use words that are age appropriate for that athlete, that they'll understand. And at that point, if there's any doubt, if they have any symptoms at all, just sit them out for the rest of that practice or game, and then refer them to their healthcare provider so that they can get a full workup. They don't need imaging typically, unless somebody is really deteriorating on the field. Maybe they seemed fine, and then now they're slipping out of consciousness, or vomiting is one, really bad nausea or vomiting. That might be reasons to send them to the ER, and they may need to get imaging, but typically you're not going to see anything for concussions with imaging. But just sending them to somebody who can manage their care, like a primary care physician, or a physiotherapist or athletic trainer that has training in concussions. Physical therapy sometimes can help with concussion symptoms as well. But really, that first step is pulling them out right away, because that's the number one thing that's going to help them have the fastest recovery.
Okay, awesome. So in your book, you give so much information, and there's so much that we didn't cover. I think there's some things just in terms of, you're suggesting go to a healthcare professional, and then I would assume that they are giving you advice as to how to care for the child thereafter. In your book, you give some ideas as well. So I think having just that team that can work together to make sure that everybody is doing their part, from the coaches to the parents to the officials to the healthcare providers, everybody needs to be in this together with the same end goal in mind. And you give a lot of great information in your book as to how to do all of that. And I would love for everybody to check it out, because I really do feel like it's super important for us all to know this. How can people find you, and how can people find your book?
And so the book is The Brain on Youth Sports, The Science, the Myths, and the Future. And you can find it on Amazon or other online retailers. There are links on my website, which is juliestamm.com.
Okay.
And you can find me on the social media. It's at Julie Stamm PhD on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything that you would like to finish us off with? Any words of wisdom that you think is really key as we wrap up?
I think the number one thing is kids should have the opportunity to play sports. And sports are so important, but their brain is also so important, and you only get one. We need to protect it. And, sports can actually benefit the brain too. They have positive changes for the brain. So let's do everything we can to provide those sport opportunities, but also protect the brain.
Awesome. I think that's so great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about all of this. And I really appreciate that you're doing all of this research, because you are making such an impact. And when you talk about purpose, life purpose, oh my goodness, your life purpose is incredible. And you're going to be, influencing so many people in a great way. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so kind. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, everybody, we're going to sign off for now. If you'd like to check out any of these episodes, you can find the podcast wherever you find your podcast. And I will see you guys on the next episode. Have a great day. Bye-bye.